Boston in November doesn't ask permission. The cold arrives before you notice it, slides under your collar, settles into your chest, and parks there with the quiet permanence of something you eventually stop calling discomfort and start calling life. Quinn Mercer had known that cold for 3 years. 3 years at Hale Dynamics. 3 years learning to treat the low-grade feeling that something was always about to go wrong as background noise, like traffic or fluorescent lighting. Tonight, she was just grateful for a bed. The company's annual conference had imploded at the last minute, the original venue cancelling with the kind of casual devastation that only institutions can manage, and the entire team had been reshuffled in emergency mode to the nearest hotel with availability. Quinn had spent the last 4 hours running damage control, rerouting catering, confirming AV equipment, fielding 17 variations of the same panicked email. By the time she finally checked in at the Whitmore's front desk, handed over her corporate card, and rode the elevator to the 12th floor, the only thing she wanted from the universe was a hot shower and 8 hours of silence. The hallway smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. She barely noticed. She was already half asleep on her feet. Room 1208. She slid the key card. The lock clicked green. The room was enormous, unapologetically, almost offensively spacious, the way rooms that cost more per night than most people's monthly rent tend to be. A king bed dominated the far wall with the quiet arrogance of something that has never once had to justify its existence. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Boston skyline, the city scattered across the dark below like a circuit board that didn't know it was being watched. Quinn dropped her bag on the armchair, rolled her shoulder where the strap had been digging in for the past hour, exhaled, long, slow, the specific exhale of someone finally setting down something heavy. She was reaching for her blazer to hang it when she heard the door. The key card, the green click, the door swinging open. She turned. Liam Hale stood in the doorway with a garment bag over one shoulder and his phone in his hand. Mid-sentence on a call he was clearly wrapping up. He stepped inside without looking up, the automatic ease of a man accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him. And then he saw her. He stopped. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. It had the specific density of 2 people doing the same rapid private calculation simultaneously and arriving at the same answer. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone and lowered it. Liam Hale, CEO, founder, billionaire with the disposition of a storm that doesn't apologize for the rain. The man she'd worked for across 3 years without him knowing her first name for most of the first. It wasn't until the 2nd year, after she'd pulled an entire project back from the edge of collapse during a presentation he hadn't even known was in danger, that he'd started calling her by her last name. He said it the same way he referred to high-value assets, precise, impersonal, certain of its worth. 42 years old, dark brown hair with threads of silver at the temples that added authority rather than subtracting it, a jaw that looked like a decision, and grey-green eyes that were, at this particular moment, moving from her face to the single bed behind her and back again with the controlled focus of someone who had just identified a structural problem. "Mercer," he said. "Hale," she said. A beat. "This is 1208, he said. "I'm aware." He looked at the key card in his hand, then at the one on the nightstand where she'd set hers. Same design, same room number printed in small gold font. "The reallocation system," she said. It wasn't a question. The conference chaos had clearly swallowed them both. 2 reservations, 1 room, nobody catching it until right now. Until this exact, irreversible moment. "Apparently," he said. Quinn turned and looked at the bed, then at the decorative loveseat along the opposite wall. 2 cushions, ornamental throw pillows, clearly selected by someone who had never once intended for it to be used as furniture. Then back at the bed. "How many other hotels have availability tonight?" she asked. He was already checking his phone. She watched the slight shift in his expression, not frustration exactly, more like the look of a man adjusting his expectations in real time, efficiently, without drama. "1," he said. 40 minutes out. The investor meeting starts at 7. "Right." The word landed flat. They both knew what it meant. Quinn unzipped her bag, pulled out her toiletry case, and set it on the dresser with the precision of someone using organization as a coping mechanism. The room suddenly felt half its size. She was acutely, unhelpfully aware of how close the doorway was, how little space existed between where she stood and where he still hadn't moved from. "I can take the sofa," he said. Not an offer. A logical solution submitted for approval. She looked at the loveseat, then at him. 6'3", and the sofa was maybe 5 feet of decorative optimism. "You'd be folded in half by morning," she said. "I don't mind." "You would." She turned to face him fully, and for a moment, just a moment, the length of a breath she didn't quite finish, she caught him looking at her. Not at the room, not at the problem, at her. The way you look at something when you think no one's watching, before the professional face slides back into place. "The bed is nearly 7 feet wide," he said, his voice perfectly even. "Functional adults can occupy opposite sides without incident." Quinn held the quiet for a beat. "Functional adults." "Right. Fine," she said. "And Hale?" He was already turning toward his garment bag. "Mercer. If you snore, I'm waking you up." The sound he made was low, barely audible, not quite a laugh, but warmer than anything she'd heard from him in 3 years of conference rooms and quarterly reviews. It loosened something in the air between them. Barely. Just enough to notice. "Fair enough," he said. She went to the bathroom, ran cold water over her wrists, and stood in front of the mirror for 2 full minutes, not thinking about anything in particular, which was its own kind of thinking. The woman looking back had her face, her posture, her practiced composure, and absolutely no useful advice. She turned off the light and went back out. Liam was in the armchair by the window, laptop open, the screen's glow casting his features in pale blue light. Boston glittered behind him like a backdrop he hadn't chosen, but wore naturally, the way certain people wear every room they enter. His jacket was off. His sleeves were rolled to the forearm, a small, almost involuntary detail that Quinn noticed and immediately decided not to think about. He didn't look up when she got into bed. She lay on her back, eyes on the ceiling, listening to the far-off murmur of the city below and the soft, steady rhythm of his fingers on the keyboard. The sheets were cold at first. That specific. Ironed flat chill of hotel linen, and she pulled them closer, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked almost like nothing at all. The room smelled faintly of his cologne, something dry and unobtrusive. She noticed it the way you notice a sound you can't unhear once you've heard it. Fine, she thought. Completely professional, completely under control. It took her 40 minutes to fall asleep. It took him 42 to stop typing, and then just sit there staring at a screen that had gone dark, in a room that had gone quiet, his eyes moving once, briefly, carefully, to the shape of her sleeping in the dark before he looked away and didn't look back. She woke at 3:14 in the morning. Cold. The hotel's heating system had failed at some point during the night, with the quiet efficiency of a well-trained traitor. Quinn reached for the blanket and found it had migrated entirely to the other side of the bed. His side. She lay still for a moment, running the calculation. The room had dropped to the specific bone-settling cold of a November night, with no insulation between her and it, and the blanket was approximately 4 feet away, and getting it meant moving, and moving meant acknowledging that she was awake, and acknowledging that she was awake meant that was when she realized Liam was awake too. She knew before she turned to look. There's a specific quality to the silence of someone sleeping versus the silence of someone lying perfectly still with their eyes open. And Quinn had learned the difference at 12 years old, sharing a small apartment with a mother who did exactly that. The breathing was too controlled, the stillness too deliberate. He was awake, and he knew she was awake, and they were both pretending, lying in the dark 3 feet apart with the careful discipline of 2 people who had spent 3 years being very, very good at pretending. "The heating's out," she said to the ceiling. "I know." "How long have you been awake?" A pause. "About an hour." Quinn turned her head. He was on his side of the bed, facing away from her, and she found herself noticing things she had no business noticing. The breadth of his shoulders under the thin hotel sheet, the way his spine curved slightly, The fact that his hair was no longer the controlled boardroom version of itself, but something looser, more human, the kind of thing you only saw when a person didn't know they were being looked at. She looked away before he could turn. "Why didn't you call the front desk?" "Didn't want to wake you." She sat with that for a moment. Liam Hale, the man who sent emails at 2 in the morning with no acknowledgement of time zones, who interrupted presentations to correct figures without a syllable of apology, whose relationship with the concept of other people's inconvenience could be generously described as indifference. That man had been lying in the cold for a full hour, in the dark, on his side of a bed he was sharing with her, waiting. The smallness of it hit harder than any grand gesture could have. It was the kind of thing that recalibrates you quietly, without announcement, a single fact that rearranges everything you thought you understood about a person, slipping in through the dark without asking permission. "I'll call," she said, and started to sit up. "Quinn." She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her first name. 3 years, always Mercer, delivered with the clipped precision of a man who maintained distance through surnames the way others maintained it through closed doors. She had never once heard her own name in his voice, and now it was there, 2 syllables hanging in the cold air of the room, softer than anything he'd ever said to her, with an edge to it she couldn't quite identify, like something he'd been holding back without realizing it until just now. She didn't respond. She waited. "Stay," he said, low, like the word had slipped free just ahead of a decision that would have stopped it. The room went very quiet. Quinn didn't move. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that seemed unreasonable for 3 a.m. In a hotel room in Boston. Outside, the city carried on without them, tires hissing through wet pavement below, the November wind pressing dead leaves against the glass, the whole indifferent machinery of Boston turning in the dark, entirely unaware that something was being decided in this room, something without a clean name. She lay back down. Same side. But the careful geography she'd maintained since midnight had quietly shifted. The deliberate 60 centimeters of neutral territory had narrowed to something she wasn't going to measure, because measuring it meant acknowledging it, and acknowledging it meant naming it. And she had spent 3 very deliberate years becoming excellent at not naming things like this. He still hadn't moved. But she could feel the change in him, a subtle shift in the quality of his stillness, the way the air between them felt different now, charged with something neither of them had authorized. The tension in his shoulders was different too, not looser, just transformed. The kind of tension that stops being about resistance and becomes about restraint. The tension of a man holding himself very carefully in place. Quinn closed her eyes. The blanket was still on his side of the bed. She hadn't gotten it. She was cold, and she hadn't gotten it, and she was not going to think about why. She felt the moment his breathing changed, a slow, almost imperceptible deepening, like a decision being made below the level of words. She felt the moment he turned, and then the warmth of him hit her. Not touch, nothing like touch, just proximity, just the heat that a body generates when it's close enough in the dark. And it was startling how much of a difference a few inches made, how the cold of the room seemed to pull back slightly, reluctantly, from that small radius of warmth between them. Neither of them spoke. She was acutely, unhelpfully aware of the distance that remained between them, close enough to feel the warmth of him, far enough to be deniable, the exact distance of something that hadn't happened yet. She felt his gaze on her the way you feel a beam of light through closed curtains, not quite seeing it but certain of its direction, its warmth, the fact that it had been there longer than either of them had said out loud. For 3 years, she had watched that attention move across balance sheets and quarterly projections, and every corner of every room they'd shared except her. Now it was still, aimed, patient in a way that made her breath go slightly uneven, and she was grateful for the dark, and grateful that her eyes were closed, and very carefully not thinking about how little space there was between not happening and happening. She could have turned. The thought arrived with the specific, inconvenient clarity of thoughts that appear at 3 a.m., uninvited and impossible to unthink. She didn't. "Go to sleep, Hale," she said instead. Quiet, almost gentle, the verbal equivalent of stepping back from a ledge. A long pause. Long enough that she wondered for one suspended moment whether he would say something else entirely. "Good night, Quinn," he said, and it was the first time her name had sounded like that in his mouth. Not a designation, not a professional marker, not the efficient shorthand of a man managing assets. Something unhurried, something that landed differently in the chest than it had any business landing. The kind of thing you file away in the part of your memory that you pretend doesn't exist. She slept. He didn't. Not for another 2 hours. He lay on his back in the dark, close enough to feel the slight warmth of her beside him, listening to the city outside and the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing, staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has just realized, quietly and with absolute certainty, that he is in considerably more trouble than he planned for, and that the most inconvenient part is that he doesn't entirely mind. By 6:45 a.m., Quinn was up, dressed, and 3 pages into the sector report on her tablet, her coffee cooling untouched on the table beside her, because she hadn't found a spare 30 seconds to reach for it. Liam came out of the bathroom at 6:52, already in his suit, tie perfectly set. The version of him that existed for the world, assembled, impenetrable, calibrated to never leave a single doubt about who held the axis of any room he entered. She watched him in her peripheral vision and thought, with a detachment she didn't entirely feel, that it was a remarkable thing, how completely a person could reconstruct themselves in under 10 minutes, how thoroughly a face could close. He looked at her. She looked at him. The night sat between them like a third presence in the room, unacknowledged, unhurried, taking up exactly as much space as they refused to give it. Neither of them mentioned it. "Sector North report," she said instead, turning the tablet toward him. "There's an inconsistency in the Q3 projection. If Hartwell pulls on line 3 during the presentation, he'll catch it." Liam looked at the numbers for exactly 3 seconds. "Correct it to 104.6, he said. "Already done." She turned the tablet back. "I just wanted to confirm you'd catch it too." Something moved through his expression, brief and controlled, gone before it could be identified, like a word he'd decided not to say. "How long have you been doing that?" he asked. "Doing what?" "Checking what I'm going to check before I check it." Quinn drank her cold coffee without blinking. Outside the window, Boston was grey and indifferent. The kind of early morning that doesn't bother with transitions, just arrives, flat and certain, demanding you meet it. 3 years, she said. He was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it needed to. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the tablet and felt his gaze anyway, steady and unhurried, the way she'd felt it in the dark a few hours ago, patient in a way that made it difficult to pretend it wasn't there. "Let's go," he said finally. The meeting ran 3 hours. Liam sat at the head of the table with the ease of someone who had never once needed to remind a room that he was in charge of it. No visible performance, no manufactured authority, just the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who had never had to prove anything to himself. He spoke rarely. When he did, the room didn't just listen, it reoriented, the way a compass reorients when something magnetic gets close enough. Quinn sat 2 seats down. She presented the sector north numbers at the precise moment he left the opening for them. She answered questions before they fully formed. When Hartwell pulled on line 3, exactly as she'd predicted, the supporting chart was already on the next slide, waiting for him with the patience of something inevitable. Liam didn't look at her during the presentation. Not once. Not while she was speaking. Not while the room was processing her numbers. Not when Hartwell leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just tried to find a crack and hadn't. When that happened, Liam simply paused. Half a second, no more, a beat so small it existed below the threshold of anything the room could have noticed, before moving to the next point. It was nothing, measurable in fractions, invisible to everyone present. Quinn felt it like a hand on her shoulder. There was a particular kind of being seen that had nothing to do with attention, not the broad, sweeping attention of a room full of people watching you speak, but the specific, precise attention of one person who has been quietly tracking the shape of you for longer than either of you has said out loud. The kind that finds you in a crowded room not because you're loud, but because something in them already knows exactly where to look. She had never let herself want that kind of attention. She had certainly never let herself want it from him. And yet there it was, half a second, a pause before a pivot, and something in her chest that she filed away without opening. In the break, she was in the corridor with her tablet when Marcus Chen materialized beside her. Director of Finance, 48, the kind of man who considered standing near a window during a break to be a form of networking. "Good work in there," he said. "Thank you. You realize Hale never lets support presenters take direct questions." Quinn said nothing. "It's his pattern," Marcus continued, with the tone of someone delivering intelligence they'd been saving. "Narrative control. He cuts in, redirects, absorbs, keeps the floor. He's done it for years." A pause. He let it sit there, that pause, the way people do when they want you to understand they've noticed something without having to say plainly what they've noticed. He didn't cut in once. She looked down the empty corridor. "Must have been an off day," she said. Marcus made a non-committal sound and drifted away. Quinn stood alone in the corridor for a moment, holding her tablet against her chest like something to hold on to. She let her gaze travel back through the glass wall of the conference room. To the head of the table, now empty, Liam's chair pushed back at a slight angle. His notepad still open to the page he'd written something on at the very start of the meeting and hadn't turned since. She didn't go in to look at it. She thought about going in to look at it, then thought about the fact that she was thinking about going in to look at it, and decided that the most professionally responsible thing she could do was walk in the opposite direction and get a coffee that was actually hot. She did. But she thought about that open notepad all the way through lunch, what he'd written, whether it mattered, whether she was constructing significance out of nothing, and why, if it was nothing, she couldn't quite stop. It wasn't what she expected. She found out by accident at 2:23 p.m. when she went back to the conference room for the charger she'd left behind. The cleaning staff hadn't come through yet. The notepad was still on the table, exactly where he'd left it, open to the same page. She should have grabbed the charger and left. Instead, she looked. The handwriting was his. Controlled, slightly angular. The same hand she'd spent 3 years reading across internal memos and margin corrections, and the occasional single-line email that somehow managed to communicate an entire position in 8 words. 2 entries. That was all. 104.6, she already knew. And below it, enclosed in a border that looked less drawn than arrived at, the kind of absent, circling mark a pen makes when a mind is somewhere other than the page. How long? Not how long has the process been inefficient, or how long until we address the gap. Just those 2 words, sitting in their small hand-drawn frame like something that had been written quickly, before the more careful part of him could decide against it. Quinn stood there looking at the notepad for a stretch of time she wasn't going to measure. They were work notes, obviously. He'd been processing the projection error, logging the correction, and the question was a professional follow-up about team methodology. That was the complete and entire explanation. She folded the charger cable into her pocket, left the room, and walked to the elevator with the measured, even steps of someone who was absolutely fine. She got in, faced the doors, watched the panel light up for the 12th floor. And only when the elevator began to move did she let the breath out, all of it at once, the kind of exhale that had been waiting since she'd looked at that notepad and felt the bottom of something shift beneath her. How long? The way he'd said it that morning. Not the meeting voice, not the voice that controlled rooms and closed arguments and made investors stop fidgeting in their chairs. The other voice, the 6:52 a.m. voice, with the tie perfectly in place and 3 years of professional distance technically intact, and something in his eyes that the professional distance had stopped covering. Quinn pressed her back against the elevator wall. The mirror behind her was cold through her blazer. She stared at the middle distance and did the thing she was very good at. The thing where she took something that was happening and placed it behind glass, somewhere she could see it without touching it until she'd decided what to do about it. "Stop," said the part of her that had learned to sound like reason. "You know where this goes. You've always known where this kind of thing goes." She did know. She'd been there before. Not with him, never with someone this complicated, but with the general shape of it. The slow accumulation of small moments. The way a person starts to take up space in your awareness before you've given them permission. She'd let it happen before, in situations with lower stakes and simpler geometry, and it had gone wrong in ways she still carried, not as open wounds, not anymore, but as a specific knowledge in the body. The kind that doesn't hurt until you press on it, and that you learn eventually not to press on. Liam Hale was her employer. He was the company. He was every professional credential she'd built across 3 years of early mornings and salvaged presentations, and being called by her last name like a designation rather than a name. And she had built those 3 years carefully, deliberately, with the specific intention of never being in a position where she had something important to lose. She was, it was becoming clear, in that position. The elevator opened on the 12th floor. He was in the hallway, back to her, phone to his ear, but not speaking this time. Listening, his head tilted at a slight angle, and there was something in the set of his shoulders she had never seen in 3 years of meetings and corridors and high-stakes presentations. A quality of ease, barely there, the way early light is barely there, but present, different from every version of him she'd catalogued, the specific looseness of a person who has just finished making a decision and not yet had to act on it. He heard her footsteps and turned, looked, and Quinn, who had spent years developing the particular skill of reading what people didn't say, who could identify from across a conference table whether a stakeholder was uncertain or merely performing uncertainty, who had learned to track the gap between a person's words and the thing their body was quietly doing, understood with a clarity that was genuinely inconvenient that this look was not professional. It wasn't the asset assessment gaze. It wasn't the structural analysis attention she'd catalogued and filed, and told herself meant nothing beyond what it was. It was direct and unhurried and specific to her in a way that made the back of her neck warm, and she held it for exactly 1 second before she made herself look away. 5 more minutes, he said into the phone, without moving his eyes from her. She gave him a small nod, moved past him, close enough in the narrow corridor that she caught the faint trace of his cologne, the same dry, understated thing she'd noticed in the dark at 3 a.m. and filed under things she wasn't going to think about, opened the room door and stepped inside. She stood with her back against the closed door. The room was quiet. The bed was made. Housekeeping had come through while they were in the meeting, erasing the evidence of the night entirely, as if the sheets hadn't held the shape of both of them a few hours ago, as if there was no small indentation in the pillow on the right side where he'd turned toward her in the dark. Everything was smooth and neutral and remade, and she was standing in the middle of it with a charger cable in her pocket, and a notable inability to remember what she'd come upstairs to do. 32 seconds. She stood there for 32 seconds. The thing about knowing something is true, and choosing not to acknowledge it, is that it requires constant, low-grade maintenance, like a dam that isn't broken, just stressed, that you have to keep tending so the water stays on the right side of the wall. She was good at the maintenance. She had been good at it for years. She had entire internal architecture dedicated to it. The notepad was the problem. 2 words in a hand-drawn box were considerably easier to maintain a dam against if they stayed in a conference room she'd already left. They hadn't stayed. She pushed off the door, crossed to the desk, hand opened the afternoon's briefing documents with the focused efficiency of a person who was going to be completely fine, who was in fact already fine, and who had a great deal of important work to attend to and absolutely no intention of standing at the window later when the city went dark and the door opened behind her, and noticing whether the quality of the silence in the room changed when he walked in. She was going to be professional about this. She was going to be excellent at it. She was going to be so professionally excellent about this that years from now, she would look back on this afternoon as the moment she made the right call, the sensible call, and none of the rest of it would have happened. And she would be fine. She believed that for approximately 4 minutes. By 10 p.m., the conference had wrapped, most of the team had dispersed to their rooms or the lobby bar, and Quinn was at the window with a glass of wine she'd ordered from room service and hadn't finished watching Boston move in the dark below her. The city never fully stilled. That was the thing about it. Even at this hour there was always motion, always light, always the faint suggestion of 1,000 things happening just out of sight. She found it easier to look at than the room behind her. Easier than thinking about the notepad. Easier than thinking about 18 months and what 18 months meant, and why she hadn't been able to stop thinking about it since 2:23 in the afternoon. Liam came in at 10:19. She heard the keycard, the door, and then his footsteps. The ones she'd learned without meaning to, deliberate and unhurried, the walk of a man who had never needed to rush because rooms arranged themselves around his timeline, not the other way around. She heard him set his blazer on the chair, heard the small familiar sound of his tie being loosened. Then silence. She was aware of him the way you're aware of a fire in a room, not looking at it, not moving toward it, but conscious of its heat along one side of your body, the way the air changes in its proximity. She kept her eyes on the city and felt him watching her and did not turn. Hartwell wants to expand into Portland, she said, neutral, professional. The voice she used when she needed the conversation to stay on a particular side of a line. The market data doesn't support the timing. There's at least 2 quarters of groundwork before any viable move. I know, he said. Are you going to approve it anyway? No. A beat. Then why did you let him present the idea for 40 minutes without interrupting? Because sometimes people need to hear their own argument to understand why it doesn't hold. Quinn turned. The lamp on the far side of the room cast everything in low, warm light, the kind of light that had no business existing in a business hotel, the kind that softened edges and made the space feel smaller than it was, more private than it had any right to be. Liam was standing in the center of the room, jacket off, tie loosened, and she was struck, not for the first time, but more acutely than usual, by the particular quality of him in an unguarded moment. Not the boardroom version, not the version calibrated for audiences. Just a man standing in lamplight with his collar open, and something unresolved in his expression, and the distance between them suddenly felt both too large and not nearly large enough. The containment he wore like a second skin was closer to the surface tonight. Not gone, not cracked thin the way ice goes thin in certain temperatures, still holding. But you become aware suddenly that it is holding. You watched me all afternoon, she said. Not an accusation, just a fact, placed carefully in the air between them, the kind of sentence that changes the temperature of a room by existing. Liam said nothing. I know that you know, she continued, her voice steady in the way a held breath is steady, controlled, but at a cost. You notice everything. It's what you do. So I'm not going to pretend I didn't notice, because you'd know I was pretending. And then we'd both be standing in a hotel room having a conversation about what each of us knows, the other one knows. And that's going to sound ridiculous at 3 in the morning. A muscle tightened in his jaw. She watched it happen. She had become, without planning to, a person who noticed the specific geography of his face. Quinn, he said, no, let me, if you're about to tell me it was professional, she said, steady, unhurried, I'm going to need you to reconsider. Because it wasn't. We both know it wasn't. And one of the things I've learned working with you is that you have no patience for imprecision. The silence that followed had weight and heat and a specific suspended quality, like the moment between lightning and thunder, when you know the sound is coming and you're already bracing for it without meaning to. Liam looked at her, really looked, not the assessment gaze, not the structural analysis attention she'd catalogued across 3 years. This was the look she'd felt in the dark at 3 a.m., the one she'd caught for half a second in the corridor, the one she'd been carrying all day like something too fragile to put down, direct, unhurried, entirely, specifically hers. The look of a man who had reached the outer limit of what he was capable of maintaining and was weighing in the space of the next breath the cost of letting it go. 18 months, he said. She didn't follow it immediately. You asked how long I've been checking what you're going to check, she said slowly. 3 years. I know how long you've been doing that, he said. 18 months is when I stopped being able to not notice. The wine glass made a soft sound against the window ledge. She set it down without looking at it, her eyes staying on him, because she understood with the particular clarity of someone standing at the edge of something that if she looked away right now, she might not find her way back to this moment, and this moment, whatever it was, felt like something that deserved to be witnessed. Liam, his name, the first time. She felt the shift the instant it left her. 2 syllables that had lived in her throat for 3 years as hail, always hail, and now something softer, something that landed differently in the air between them, something that could not be taken back, and that she found with quiet surprise she didn't want to take back. She saw it move through him, a micro-reaction, there and gone in under a second, the specific involuntary response of a person hearing something they have wanted to hear for longer than they've admitted. He didn't quite control it in time. She thought that might be the most honest thing she'd ever seen him do. "I know what this is," he said, lower now. The last traces of the professional register were gone, and what remained was quieter and more careful. A voice she hadn't heard before, one that felt like the room he kept behind all the other rooms. "I know what you're going to say. I know the reasons why I shouldn't have said what I just said." "And you said it anyway?" "Yes." "Why?" He held her gaze for a long moment. Outside, the city moved below them, indifferent, unhurried, knowing nothing of the specific gravitational pull of 2 people standing across a room from each other at 10 p.m. in November, both very still, both very aware. A car horn rose from the street and came through the glass, muffled and distant, a sound from another world entirely. "Because you're leaving tomorrow," he said. "And I was going to keep being the man who spent a night in a hotel room with you and said nothing." He stopped. Something crossed his face. Not quite pain, not quite relief. The expression of a person setting down something heavy they'd been carrying for a long time without acknowledging the weight. That was unacceptable. Quinn looked at him. Liam Hale, who never asked, who required or didn't bother, who had built a company and a reputation and an entire carefully constructed life without showing a single fracture to a single person, standing in the warm light of a hotel room in Boston, collar open, hand loose at his side, telling her that silence about her was the thing he couldn't accept. The smallness of it. The enormity of it. Both at once. "You know this complicates everything," she said. Not resistance, just fact. The last responsible thing she could think to say. "I know. I work for you. I know." Then, Quinn. Her name again. And she felt it again, that same low resonance it had carried at 3 a.m. The version that didn't sound like a designation or a professional address, but like something he'd been saving, something used carefully, the way you use the last of something you can't replace. I know all of it. I'm telling you anyway because..." A pause, and in the pause, uncertainty. Not weakness, the specific, unguarded uncertainty of a man who has always known his coordinates and has just looked up to find the landmarks gone. "Because I'm not good at this." He took a step toward her. Not closing the distance, not all of it, but one step, deliberate and unhurried. And suddenly the room was a different size than it had been a moment ago. She felt the shift in her sternum before she processed it consciously. "This..." A slight gesture between them, and she watched his hand. That precise, controlled hand she had watched move across contracts and diagrams and the margins of documents for 3 years, make a motion that was none of those things, unguarded, almost helpless. "Is not something I know how to do. But you've spent 3 years being the most precise person I've ever worked with, and I've spent 18 months trying not to notice that it was more than that." Another step. Slow, like a question being asked without words, waiting for an answer before it continued. "The heating went out last night," he said, his voice lower now, closer now. "And you stayed on your side and I stayed on mine, and I lay there for 2 hours listening to you breathe and thinking about..." He stopped. She could see the slight rise and fall of his chest from here, could see the way his eyes moved over her face, unhurried, taking inventory, the way you look at something you've been careful not to look at directly for a very long time. "I can't keep pretending it's just work," he said. They were close now, not touching, nothing so simple as touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him, close enough that the space between them had stopped being neutral. It was charged and deliberate, and full of every unsaid thing from 18 months and 1 hotel room and a notepad with 2 words in a hand-drawn box. Quinn didn't move toward him. She didn't move away. She looked up at him, at the open, unguarded face of a man who had just handed her something real and was waiting, with a patience that cost him, to see what she would do with it. The lamplight caught the silver at his temples. His jaw was tight, his eyes were steady and dark, and entirely, devastatingly focused on her. She was aware of his breathing. She was aware of her own. She was aware of exactly how little space remained between them, and exactly what it would take to close it, and exactly how much she wanted to, and exactly why she hadn't yet. "Liam," she said again, barely above a whisper. His gaze dropped, just for a fraction of a second, just briefly, to her mouth, and came back up. And that fraction of a second did something to the temperature of the room that no heating system failure ever could have. He waited. The whole city waited, or seemed to. Quinn was quiet for long enough that the silence became a third presence in the room. Then she reached for the wineglass, took a slow sip, set it back down. She looked at the city instead of him, at the lights below, steady and indifferent, doing what lights do regardless of what happens in the rooms above them. She needed something that wasn't his face for the next few sentences. "When I was 26, she said, I got involved with someone from work, not my boss, a peer. Same structure, same project, and it felt different because we'd built something together. His ideas and mine, and they got better when they were in the same room." She paused. The wineglass had left a faint ring on the window ledge. She looked at it. It felt like a reason. He said nothing. He waited, and she noticed that the specific quality of his waiting, not the impatient silence of a man tolerating an anecdote, the real kind, the kind that makes space without filling it. "When it ended, I lost the project," she continued. "Not formally. Nobody removed me. But the dynamic shifted, and projects run on dynamics. And once a dynamic changes, it doesn't go back to what it was. It goes somewhere new, and new isn't always better. And I learned that you can't separate things as cleanly as you think you can before you try." "Did you leave the company?" 6 months later. She looked at him finally. He hadn't moved. He was watching her with the full, undivided attention he usually reserved for problems that required solving, and the fact that she was the problem, not a problem, she corrected herself, the subject, made the air in her lungs feel slightly thicker. "Not because anyone asked me to, because I couldn't walk into those rooms anymore without carrying the weight of it." Liam was quiet for a moment. "I'm not him," he said. "I know you're not. And you're not the same person you were at 26. "No," she agreed. "I'm older. I have more to lose. Or more clarity about what's worth losing." She looked at him. That landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to, and she let it just for a second before she filed it away with the other things she wasn't opening tonight. His arms were crossed now, not defensively, but with the particular tension of a man containing something that might otherwise move without his permission. The lamplight fell across his jaw, the open collar of his shirt, the silver at his temples. She was aware of him with a thoroughness that was becoming difficult to categorize as anything professional. She had been aware of him that way for longer than tonight. That was, perhaps, the entire problem. "What do you want, Liam?" she asked, direct, no filter. The question she'd been building toward since he'd said 18 months, and she'd felt the floor shift beneath her. Not what makes sense. Not what's defensible. What do you actually want? The question lived in the air between them. He uncrossed his arms. He took 2 steps toward her, slow and deliberate, each one a sentence, and she felt them before she heard them, felt the room contracting around the closing distance, felt her own breathing make a small, involuntary adjustment, the way breathing does when something important is happening and the body knows before the mind has finished the thought. Quinn didn't step back, but she felt it, the specific, irreducible pull of his proximity, the way certain people occupy space differently than other people, the way the air changes near them. She had felt it across conference tables and in hallways and at 3 a.m. in the dark. Up close, it was something else entirely. Up close, it was considerably harder to file under things that don't require acknowledgement. "You," he said. Simple. No ornament. Delivered with the same quiet certainty he used for financial projections and structural decisions, not as a declaration, but as a fact, as something that existed independent of whether it was convenient. as something he had apparently decided, at some point in the last 18 months, was simply true. Quinn held the word, let it settle, felt it settle, lower than she intended, warmer than she was prepared for. She wanted to say something measured, something that demonstrated she was approaching this with the appropriate gravity. Instead, she stood there, half a room away from him, and thought about the notepad. About how long in its hand-drawn box, about the way he'd said her name in the dark and then lain awake for 2 hours that she'd spent pretending not to notice. That's terrifying, she said. I know. Not because of you, because I'm very good at leaving when things get too real. It's practically a skill at this point. A breath, almost a laugh, almost, and you just made everything very real, very fast. He was close now, close enough that she could see the slight tension in his jaw, the steadiness in his eyes, the deliberate stillness of a man holding himself carefully in place, 1/2 meter between them, maybe less, the kind of distance that had a specific physical quality to it, not comfortable, not uncomfortable, charged in a way that made her aware of her own hands, her own pulse, the exact temperature of the air in the narrow space he hadn't crossed yet. Then don't leave, he said. Just like that? No. His eyes were direct and unguarded, no professional layer, no careful distance, just him, looking at her the way she'd felt him looking in the dark, and it was different to see it in the light, more, harder to look at and harder to look away from, but it's what I'm asking. And it was that word, asking, that reached somewhere the other words hadn't. Liam Hale, who never asked, who required or walked away, who had built an empire on the premise that he didn't need to ask for anything, was asking. Quietly, without leverage, without the armor, for her. Quinn raised her hand and placed it flat against his chest. She felt his heartbeat immediately, and the relief of that, the strange grounding relief of feeling that he was not as composed as he looked, that his heart was doing exactly what hers was doing, fast and declarative and entirely out of step with the controlled surface of him. Something about that equalized the room, made it possible to breathe. We'd need rules, she said. You can make whatever rules you want. You won't like all of them. Probably not. She didn't move her hand. He didn't move at all, as though any motion might disturb the particular fragile balance of this moment, might tip it somewhere neither of them had agreed to go yet. The lamplight was warm. Outside, Boston turned over slowly in the November dark, unaware and unconcerned the way cities are. 2 people on the 12th floor deciding something with no road back. The city didn't know. The city didn't care. Quinn was aware of the warmth of him beneath her palm, the steady, slightly too fast rhythm of his heart, the way he was looking at her, patient and open and wanting in a way he wasn't bothering to hide anymore, and the not hiding was its own kind of thing, its own specific gravity. Give me time, she said finally, not a refusal. Her condition, the most honest thing she knew how to offer. Not forever, just how much? Enough that I stop being afraid you're just another place I'm going to have to leave. Something moved through his face, not softening exactly, because Liam Hale didn't soften, but opening. The particular opening of a person who has just been given something they weren't expecting and isn't sure yet what to do with the fact that it matters this much. A window, cracked, just enough to feel the air move through. All right, he said. She lowered her hand slowly. The absence of his heartbeat under her palm was its own kind of information. She went to her side of the bed. And this time when she lay down there was no careful geography, no deliberate 60 centimeters of neutral territory, no performance of professional distance. She lay down and he lay down, and the space between them was what it was, which was close, which was chosen, which was nothing. Either of them was going to pretend had anything to do with the temperature of the room. Boston turned outside the window. The lamplight went dark. And in the quiet that followed, the specific weighted quiet of 2 people lying in the dark, having said true things and now living inside them, Quinn listened to his breathing slow and felt the warmth of him beside her, and thought that this was either the beginning of something she hadn't known she needed, or the most expensive decision she'd ever made. She thought it might be both. She closed her eyes and decided that was all right. The morning after arrived with the particular clarity of cities that snow early, everything too clean, too sharp, the shadows more precise than they had any right to be. Boston, in the cold hours before 9, looked like a city that had been edited overnight, stripped of ambiguity, every edge defined. They came down separately, her 10 minutes first, him 10 minutes after, professional, deliberate, the kind of arrangement that works perfectly in theory and requires a specific low-grade effort to execute when you can still feel the texture of the night before on everything, in the way the elevator button felt under her finger, in the way the lobby looked slightly different than it had 48 hours ago, in the way she was aware, stepping out into the cold, of the 10 minutes she was putting between them and what they meant. The car back took 40 minutes. They each kept to their own phones, their own silence. The carefully maintained parallel of two people who had an understanding and were, for now, keeping it close. Halfway through, without looking up from his screen, he said, "Dinner Friday." Not a question. Quinn looked at him. "Is that a request or an invitation?" He looked up. One beat, and there it was. That almost thing at the corner of his mouth, the expression she'd been cataloguing for 3 years without a name for it, and now had considerably more context for. "An invitation?" he said. "Better," she said, and went back to her phone. Outside, Boston moved past the window. The bridges, the river, the skyline she knew from years of early mornings and late nights, and every variation of grey the sky above this city could produce. She knew this view. She had looked at it from taxi windows and the tea and her own apartment, and 100 conference room windows above streets she could navigate with her eyes closed. It looked different now. Not the city was exactly what it had always been. But there was a man beside her who had said you the night before with the simplicity of a true thing, and the early light was catching the water below the bridges. And Boston looked the way familiar places sometimes look, when you're seeing them from a new angle. The same and not the same, like a song you've known for years played in a different key. At the office for the next 2 weeks nothing visibly changed. She still arrived 8 minutes early. His door still sat slightly ajar in the mornings, the unspoken office code for come in if it matters. Meetings happened in meeting rooms, emails arrived at the hours emails arrived, and Marcus Chen noticed absolutely nothing different, because Marcus Chen's awareness began and ended at the quarterly figures. What changed was subtler than any of that. He started leaving his door fully open when she was on the schedule. She started taking her Friday coffee in his office instead of the break room, a shift so small it could have meant nothing, that she was aware meant everything. And on a Thursday at 7 p.m., when the floor had emptied out and she was at her desk rereading a contract with her head propped on one hand, he walked past, stopped, looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the corridor of the 12th floor and said, "Go home, Mercer," in a tone that was not the tone he used for everyone else. She went home. She smiled in the elevator in a way that was fortunate nobody was there to see. Friday arrived the way important evenings tend to, quietly, without announcement. Just suddenly there when she opened her eyes in the morning. Quinn spent longer than usual getting ready, not anxiously, deliberately, with the specific attention of a woman who knows what she's doing and has decided to do it well. She wore a deep burgundy dress that she'd owned for 2 years and worn exactly once, structured at the shoulders and fitted through the waist, the kind of garment that required standing up straight and rewarded it. Her hair down, which she almost never wore down outside of weekends, dark against the dress, against her collarbone. Low heels, dark coat, a single thin gold necklace that sat at the base of her throat like punctuation. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment before leaving. She looked like a woman who had made a decision. The restaurant was somewhere she didn't know, tucked into the South End, small, unassuming, the kind of place that cost what it cost without needing to announce it, the kind of place someone chooses when they want the evening to be about something other than the setting. Liam was already there when she arrived. She came in 2 deliberate minutes late, not enough to be rude, just enough to not be early, and pushed through the door into the warm, low-lit interior. He saw her immediately. She watched it happen, the way his attention, which had been resting on the table, moved to the door and found her and then simply stopped. Not the half-second of stillness she'd catalogued before. Longer, the kind of pause that a controlled man allows himself when he's decided for once not to manage it. He stood, and then quietly, without preamble, "You look—" He stopped, started again, with the particular care of a man choosing the precise word, the right word, the only word. "Remarkable." It landed differently than a compliment from someone trying to impress. It landed the way true things land, simply without decoration, with the specific weight of something that was said, because it was accurate and for no other reason. Quinn felt it move through her from her throat to somewhere considerably lower and held his gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. "You cleaned up yourself," she said, sitting down. He had. The tie was gone. She was beginning to understand that the absence of the tie was a language, his particular way of signaling which version of himself had shown up. The coat was dark, soft wool, nothing like the structured architecture of his office wardrobe. He looked like a man who had decided to simply be himself tonight, without the scaffolding, and the result was, she was aware, in a way that required some management, considerably more than she'd budgeted for. "Tell me something I don't know about you," she said. He considered it, genuinely, in the unhurried way he approached things that deserved thought, and she noticed the particular quality of being on the receiving end of that attention, when it wasn't directed at a problem to be solved. "I cook," he said. She waited. "Badly," he added, "genuinely, impressively badly. But I cook." She laughed. The real kind, low and surprised, the kind that escapes before you've decided to let it out. It was in the air between them before she could make it presentable, and she found she didn't want to make it presentable, and that was its own small revelation. Liam looked at her with an expression she had never once seen across 3 years of board meetings and quarterly reviews. Pure, uncomplicated satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of a closed deal or a corrected projection, the satisfaction of a man who has just made a specific person laugh in a specific way, and finds that this, exactly this, was the point of the evening. "Your turn," he said. "I'm afraid of heights. I live on the 10th floor. "Why?" "Because the view is good and I refuse to let fear win every battle." He looked at her for a moment that ran a second longer than necessary, that particular extra second she'd learned to track, the one that meant something was being registered, filed, kept. "That's very you," he said, and it was. It was entirely, specifically her, and the fact that he knew that he had assembled enough of her to know that without being told, made the wine in her glass suddenly necessary. Dinner lasted 3 hours, not because there was an agenda, not because either of them was performing, but because the conversation moved the way good conversations do, from one true thing to the next, and neither of them was in a hurry to arrive at the end of it. She learned that he'd built the first iteration of Hale Dynamics in a rented office above a dry cleaner in Cambridge at 31, that he read history the way other people watched television, that he hadn't taken a vacation in 4 years and knew it, and had no immediate plans to correct it. He learned that she'd grown up moving, 7 cities before 18, and that she'd chosen Boston specifically because it was the first place that had felt, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, like somewhere she might stay. That she'd been right. That she'd been here 6 years and still sometimes stood at her apartment window at night, with something that felt, cautiously, like belonging. He listened to all of it with the full, undivided attention she'd spent 3 years watching him give to quarterly projections. It felt, directed at her across a small table in the South End, like something else entirely. The restaurant emptied around them gradually, tables going quiet one by one, until the staff were moving with the particular polite efficiency of people waiting for the last guests to notice the hour. Quinn noticed. She looked around at the nearly empty room and then back at him, and found him already looking at her, and there was something in his expression, open, unhurried, warm in a way the boardroom version of him had never been, that made the next moment feel both inevitable and entirely her choice. "I don't want to go home," she said, simply, honestly. The way she'd learned across the last week that things said plainly between them landed better than things said carefully. Liam held her gaze. Outside, through the restaurant window, Boston was doing what Boston does on November nights, cold and lit and indifferent and beautiful. "Then don't," he said. His apartment was in Back Bay, a top-floor space that managed to feel both expansive and lived in, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected something sterile, something that looked like a showroom or a statement. Instead, walls of books organized with the slight imperfection of someone who actually reads them, a kitchen that showed evidence of his claimed, and apparently genuinely terrible, cooking, a wide bank of windows that gave the entire city back to you at once. Quinn stood at those windows for a long moment. 10 floors, she said. 14, he said, from somewhere behind her. I'm fine, she said. And she was, or rather she was aware of the height and choosing, as she always did, not to let it win. She felt him before she heard him, the warmth of him arriving just behind her, close enough that the city and the glass showed both their reflections, hers and his overlaid on the lights of Boston below. You weren't wrong about the view, she said quietly. No, he said, just as quietly. And she understood from the direction of his voice that he wasn't looking at the city. She turned. The distance between them was nothing, a decision, the length of a breath, held and then released. His hand came up, slow, deliberate, with all the careful patience that she had come to understand, was not restraint but respect, the physical language of a man who did not take things that hadn't been offered, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His fingers grazed her jaw, stayed. She leaned into it, just slightly, just enough. Liam, she said. Not a warning, not a question, something else entirely. He understood. He had, she was beginning to think, always understood. Later, much later, when the city outside had gone to its quieter frequencies and the apartment had settled into the specific, warm stillness of a place that has just become the setting for something that changes things, Quinn lay in the dark and listened to Boston below and thought about what it felt like to have been afraid of something for a long time, and then discover that the thing itself was nothing like the fear. She thought it was better, considerably, unexpectedly, irreversibly better. Perfeito. Robert Charles soa exatamente como diretor financeiro, que acha que observar pela janela durante uma pausa é networking. Vou reescrever o capítulo 8 completo com a substituição e também atualizo retroativamente todas as menções nos capítulos anteriores. Nos capítulos 3 e 4, onde Marcus Chen aparece, o nome passa a ser Robert Charles automaticamente. Segue o capítulo reescrito. It lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of dinners and coffees and conversations that moved past work into the territory of actual things, preferences and histories and the small, specific details that accumulate between two people when neither of them is performing. 3 weeks of his door fully open when she arrived in the mornings, of Friday coffees that stretched past the professional pretense of having an agenda, of the particular quiet pleasure of being known by someone who paid attention the way he paid attention, precisely, without waste, catching the things she didn't say as readily as the things she did. Quinn recognized it as real specifically because there was no rush in it, no performance, none of the markers she'd learned to associate with things that eventually cost you. And then Robert Charles opened his mouth in a board meeting. She knew something had changed before she understood what. There was a quality to the room when she walked in, a particular configuration of averted eyes and adjusted postures, the social equivalent of a held breath. Robert Charles wasn't looking at her, which was unusual because Robert Charles looked at everyone with the same expression of a man quietly assessing market value. The meeting was about team restructuring. Halfway through, with the specific brand of casual that is never actually casual, Robert said, "We should have a conversation about potential conflicts of interest in leadership positions." Liam was at the head of the table. He didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't adjust his pen, didn't do any of the small involuntary things people do when a sentence lands somewhere uncomfortable. He simply stayed exactly as he was, which was its own kind of answer. Specifically, Robert continued, regarding relationships within the company's hierarchical structure, the silence that followed was brief and total. Quinn felt her stomach settle in a way she recognized, the specific physical sensation of standing on something that has just become unreliable beneath your feet. She kept her face neutral. She had a great deal of practice keeping her face neutral. She was grateful in a distant and somewhat grim way for all that practice. If there's a specific concern, Liam said, his voice completely flat. "Bring it through the correct channel." "This is a matter of corporate governance." Robert. Just the name. Delivered with the quietness he used to close things without raising his voice, the verbal equivalent of a door being shut with perfect control. Correct channel. The meeting continued. Quinn didn't look at Liam for the remainder of it. Afterward, she was waiting for the elevator when he appeared beside her. "Quinn." "Not now," she said. "Low. Even." "Mercer." "Not now, Hale." The elevator opened. She stepped in. The doors closed between them, and she stared at her own reflection in the brushed steel, and did not let herself think about the expression on his face in the half-second before the doors met, because thinking about it would require feeling it, and feeling it was not something she could afford in a building where 14 people had just watched her leave a room without looking at her boss. The thing about fear is that it rarely arrives honestly. It doesn't knock. It doesn't announce itself as fear. It arrives dressed as reason, wearing the vocabulary of self-protection, presenting a very organized case for why the door should be closed and locked, and why you were right to have never opened it in the first place. It sounds like wisdom. It sounds like experience. It sounds, if you've spent enough years listening to it, remarkably like your own voice. Quinn knew this. She had always known this. Knowing it did not make the voice quieter. She spent the rest of the day in the mode she knew best, efficient, precise, impermeable. She answered emails. She finalized the Portland report. She left at 6 p.m. without looking down the corridor where his office was, without checking whether the door was open or closed, without doing any of the small involuntary things she'd apparently been doing for weeks, without fully accounting for them until they were suddenly things she was choosing not to do. The walk to the T felt longer than usual. The city was doing its November thing, cold and bright and indifferent, and she was grateful for the cold, and less grateful for the brightness, and entirely ungrateful for the indifference because she would have appreciated, just this once, some external sign that the world understood the specific weight of what had just shifted. It didn't offer one. At home, she lay on her couch and looked at the ceiling for 40 minutes. The apartment was familiar in the way that only your own space is familiar. Every shadow in the right place, the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the distant sound of the city below doing what it always did. She had chosen this apartment because it felt like somewhere she might stay. She had been right, she had stayed. And the ceiling had seen a great many things. Hand was currently offering nothing in the way of guidance, which was consistent with its entire history as a ceiling. The phone stayed quiet for an hour. Then it vibrated. One message. No preamble. "Can I come over?" Quinn looked at the screen for a long time. The part of her that had learned, through practice, through necessity, through the specific curriculum of having left before she was asked to leave, said no. Said that this was exactly it. The meeting, Robert, the corridor, the elevator doors closing between them. This was the shape of what she'd been afraid of, and it had arrived on schedule, and the correct response was the one she already knew how to give. That part of her was organized and had good references, and had never once been wrong about the mechanics of what happened next. The other part, the one that had stood at 14 floors of windows and refused to let the height win, the one that had placed an open hand on his chest and felt his heart going at exactly the same speed as hers, the one that had said, "Give me time" instead of goodbye, went quiet for a moment, looked at what the first part was offering, recognized it clearly and without comfort for what it actually was, not wisdom, not experience. Fear in a good coat, presenting itself as reason, doing what fear does when it's been invited in enough times to know where the lights are. She looked at the message. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about 3 weeks, not the grand moments, but the small ones. The way he said her name now, the full version, like it meant something specific. The way he'd listened across that restaurant table, as though her words were worth the same careful attention he gave to things that mattered. The way his heart had been fast under her palm, and how that small fact had been the most honest thing anyone had offered her in a very long time. She typed, "Yes," one word, sent before the first part of her could make its counter-argument, and then she set the phone face down on the cushion and sat in the quiet of her apartment and waited. Not with dread, not with certainty, but with the specific, slightly terrifying openness of someone who has just decided for the second time to choose the harder thing. Outside, Boston lit itself up in the dark, the way it always did, indifferent and beautiful, and entirely unaware that something was being decided on the 10th floor of a building on Commonwealth Avenue. Something that felt for once like it might be worth the cost of being afraid of it. Perfeito. Quase 400 palavras. Foco na cena do vinho e das regras. Tudo o mais destilado ao essencial. He arrived with a bottle of wine she hadn't asked for and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Exhaustion. Not the workday kind. The exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that putting it down has started to feel like its own kind of risk. Quinn opened the door, let him in, stood with her back to the window. "You knew there was a risk," she said, "and you didn't tell me." "Yes. That wasn't your call to make alone." "No," he agreed. "It wasn't. I thought I could manage it before it became something you'd need to know about. I was wrong." A pause, not defensive, not searching for an angle. Just a man holding what he'd gotten wrong without trying to reframe it. "The omission was mine. I don't have a defense for it." She looked at him. "I'm not afraid of you," she said quietly. "I'm afraid of the pattern, of being the person with less power in the structure when it goes wrong. I know. You don't, not from that side of it." He went still with that. Really still, the silence of someone receiving something they can't argue with and isn't trying to. It lasted long enough to be real. "You're right," he said, "but I can learn what I don't know if you tell me." And that, not "I understand," not "it won't happen again," was the thing that reached somewhere the other words hadn't. An open hand, an actual request. Quinn went to the table. Opened the wine, set out 2 glasses. "Robert is going to be a problem," she said, handing him one. "Robert is going to try." "Not the same thing." "No." His fingers brushed hers on the glass, brief, unhurried. "But there are certain things that are founder's prerogative, and I have no intention of letting anyone decide what's mine." The word "mine" landed quietly between them. She let it. "Neither do I," she said. He looked at her over the rim of his glass, open, steady, wanting in a way he'd stopped pretending otherwise. "So," he said, "we're going to need those rules," she said. "The ones I won't like. Some of them." The corner of his mouth moved, just enough. "All right," he said. And they stayed there. Wine, city lights. The quiet of 2 people building something they'd stopped pretending wasn't real. February in Boston has a different quality than November. November is the cold arriving, the city bracing, people still surprised by the weight of the air. February is the cold that stayed, deeper, quieter, with nothing left to prove. The cold of something that has already been through the worst of itself and is now simply being what it is. Quinn had always preferred February for exactly that reason. She was at her desk at 8:47 when he came in through the side door, the one off the project corridor. The one she'd learned was how he entered when he was coming specifically to her, and preferred that not to be the first thing the entire floor knew about his morning. He set a coffee beside her keyboard without a word, made the way she took it. She hadn't had to tell him that in a long time. 10 o'clock, he said. Robert's presenting Portland again. With different numbers. She took the coffee. Still wrong. You've already built the counter. She looked up. He tilted his chin toward her screen, the spreadsheet tab, open and waiting, assembled with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had done it 2 days ago and hadn't mentioned it. I notice, he said simply, with the echo of 18 months ago of a notepad and 2 words in a hand-drawn box. I noticed before. Now I have permission to say so. Quinn looked at him, really looked the way she allowed herself to now without the old machinery of pretending she wasn't. Liam Hale, who cooked badly and walked to restaurants because he needed the air and had asked instead of required once in a hotel room in November, which had changed the entire shape of what came after. Being noticed from a distance was one thing. Being noticed from here, from inside it with nothing to manage and nowhere to pretend, was something else, something warmer. Something she was still, 3 months in, getting used to in the best possible way. Robert's burying the entry costs in Appendix C, she said. I know. You're going to let him present the whole thing anyway, so he can hear his own argument. And then I'll take apart Appendix C. With data you've had ready since Tuesday. She smiled, small and real, and entirely his. The 10 o'clock went exactly as they'd mapped it. Robert presented. Liam listened. Quinn dismantled Appendix C with surgical precision, and the room arrived at the inevitable conclusion without anyone needing to announce it. Robert argued for 15 minutes, then went quiet with the particular expression of a man who has finally heard his own argument clearly enough to understand why it doesn't hold. In the corridor afterward, Liam fell into step beside her for exactly 1 second. "Dinner," he said. "Friday. Tonight." She looked at him. "Tonight is Wednesday." "I know." And there it was, in the grey-green eyes that had been watching her in one way or another for 18 months before either of them had said so. Not the asset assessment gaze, not the careful, managed distance. Just him. Steady and open and looking at her the way he'd looked at 3 a.m. In a hotel room when the cold was an excuse and the professionalism was a shield. Except that now it was February, and neither of them needed an excuse, and neither of them was pretending to be asleep. "Tonight," she said. At 6:30 the floor had emptied to its last few holdouts. Quinn was pulling on her coat when she heard the footsteps in the corridor. Deliberate, unhurried. The rhythm she'd have known anywhere by now. "Mercer," he said from the doorway. She turned. Dark wool coat. No tie. The version of him that had walked to a restaurant in the South End because he needed the air. The real one, the unscaffolded one, the one she'd been watching become more itself with every passing week, until it was simply the only version she thought about anymore. "Hail," she said. He smiled. Not the almost smile she'd spent 3 years cataloguing. The real one, unhurried, unguarded, complete. The kind that had clearly been waiting a long time to exist and had finally decided it had waited long enough. It did something to the room. It did something to her. Both things she had long since stopped pretending otherwise. She picked up her bag, walked to the door, walked past him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm, close enough to feel the warmth of him, close enough that Boston outside the window and the whole long road from November to February collapsed, briefly, into just this. The two of them, in a doorway with nowhere else to be. He fell into step beside her. And Quinn Mercer, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of leaving before things got too real, didn't leave. She stayed. And it turned out that staying, when it was the right thing, felt nothing like what she'd always been afraid it would feel like. It felt like February, like the cold that had already been through the worst of itself, like something that had decided, quietly and without fanfare, to simply remain